And we have this because in 1989, the American Federation of Labor Congress of Industrial Organizations, better known as the AFL-CIO, commemorated this day because in 1971, OSHA was started, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, promising that every person would be working in a safe workplace. But they watched through the years and they saw how many thousands of people were killed, how many millions of people were injured, and said, you know what, we can't pretend that OSHA made this all better. And so now we have Workers' Memorial Day to remember those who were lost on the job. And we can't name all of those who were injured on the job because it's far too many, but we do remember those from this part of the state of New Jersey who were indeed lost. Evelyn and I are going to read a poem. I just wanted to tell you one other statistic that I read. In the state of New Jersey, if a OSHA supervisor comes to your work site to make sure that it's a safe work site, we are so short of OSHA supervisors that they will not come back to your work site for another 134 years. Think about that. Think about that. Yeah. Thus, the problem that we have with so many deaths and injuries on the job. And even the fines that they impart on the employers, they're not, it's worth it for them just to pay for those. So, yeah, so we have a lot more that we have to do, and unions, labor unions all over the country are working for safer and safer workplaces with dignity. So we have a poem that's entitled "The Plan" by Sue Waltz, and we read this every year because it tells you, it reminds you of the importance of life and how quickly it could change. I am your mother,
father,
sister,
brother,
child,
partner,
lover,
friend.
I didn't plan to die today, but I did. Today I plan to take a walk,
see a friend,
tell a joke,
give a smile,
pay a bill,
play a game,
take a ride,
kiss a cheek,
hug a child. I didn't plan to die today, but I did. I planned to go to work,
build a bridge,
pave a road,
fix a pipe,
teach a class,
save a life,
paint a room,
write reports,
enter data,
work the line,
wire buildings,
walk the iron,
erect the steel.
I didn't plan to die today,
but I did. Please think of me just once today when you fulfill your plans. I'm your mother,
father,
sister,
brother,
child,
partner,
lover,
friend.
I didn't plan to die today, but I did. Yeah, it's heavy, but it's a harsh reminder of how dangerous it could be in the workplace. Before we start reading the names of the people who died in 2022, we're going to light those candles that you have on your chairs. Okay, it has a higher wick. Thank you so much. These candles were donated to us by Greenbaum's Furniture Store in Paterson, I would say like 40 years ago. I'm serious. Today we remember Ascension Martinez, age 62, struck by a motor vehicle. Kenneth Barati, age 68, crushed by a refuse truck load arm. Miles Jones, age 24, caught between the dock and a tracking trailer. Simon Box, age 37, struck in the head by a shattered piece of granite. Creslaw Solaro, suffocating in a facility fire. Armando Rubao, crushed by a rolling machine during the startup. And Jamie Ramirez, Cybrarian, from a fatal head injury due to a ladder fall, age 55.
William Keith Bemis, 55 years old, fatal fall from aerial lift bucket. Rafael Geron Perez, 50 years old, fall from tree. Alexander Rivera, 45, drowned. Carl Carino, 50 years old, COVID-19. Zu Sokasam, 71, struck by object. Devon Brown, 19, crushed by object. Robert Sanger, 62, fall. Olegario dos Santos, 45, struck by object. Bruce Cheeseman, 48, burns. Javier Diaz Alaya, 47, fall. Roger Bolin, 58, head injury. Earl Brown, 62, fall. Ryan Deacus, 37, drowned. Rial Neron, 78, head injury.
Dale DeBelli, age 63, caught in a fire. Antonio Marquez, 57, struck by an object. Donato Fiolcia, struck by an object, age 53. Victor Martinez, age 55, struck by an object. Javier Castanelo, age 40, struck by an object. Philip Morrissey, age 60, struck by an object. Thomas Westos, 36, struck by an object. Edward Goosen, age 56, COVID-19 as a result of being in the workplace. Robert Thornton, age 31, struck by an object. Arno Sorrell, 76, cardiac incident. Ishka Kostadinov, age 62, heart attack. Jose Garcia, 44, from a fall. Gregorio Reyes, age 60, from a gunshot in the workplace. Deju Noel, age 56, from a fall. And John Luna Jr., age 64, from COVID-19.
Uriel Matamoros, 59 years old, struck by an object. Jorg Vasquez, 53 years old, a fall. Thomas Edwards Weston, 36 years old, struck by object. John Molinar, 47 years old, asphyxia due to oxygen displacement and drowning. Dean Battaglia, 53 years old, struck by a vehicle.
And in addition to these men and women who we have mentioned, there are others who have died throughout the state of New Jersey, and over 70,000 injuries throughout our state as a result of workplace injuries. Let's remember these people, and if you have anyone who you'd like to remember this evening, please say their name. Thank you. Our guest speaker tonight, we're all looking forward to hearing you
So we are very pleased to welcome Dan J. Willever to the museum. He's been here several times. I remember when you came and told me about your research.
It's a few years ago now. Time flies.
So in addition to our traditional candlelight vigil, Daniel J. Willever will discuss from the silk mills to the Senate, Paterson's Billy Hughes, and the fight for labor's cause. Mr. Willever, who has a master's degree and a master's in education, is a lifelong resident of Passaic County and a social studies teacher at Ramsey High School. He has authored the new book, Made in Paterson, The Life and Legacy of US Senator William Hughes, and that's published this year in 2023. And his presentation will features a display of artifacts from Hughes' life and career, including original photos, signed documents, and a 1912 campaign pin, which is in the center of the table. The books are here for purchase and for signing. Senator Hughes, who was born in 1872 and died in 1918, Dan argues, and rightly so, is an advocate for the workers of Paterson, New Jersey, and of the nation. Dan's project traces Hughes's origins in the local labor movement in Paterson and his work defending striking silk weavers from prosecution in the early 20th century. After winning election to Congress in 1902 against his former employer, Hughes embarked upon a nearly two-decade crusade to enshrine protections for American workers into federal law. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the New Jersey recipient of the Milken Educator Award in 2019 and recognized for excellence in teaching, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you, Evelyn, for that nice introduction, and I'm very happy to be here this evening to address you all on Workers' Memorial Day. As a school teacher, I'd like to say that safety is something that's on my mind all too often these days in the workplace. It's an unfortunate reality of the times that we live in, and hopefully as time goes on, we'll see some significant improvements made, not just for people who work in our schools, but in all lines of work around not just our country, but the world. And I'm going to address a little bit about that towards the end of my talk this evening. You gave a very nice overview, Evelyn, of Billy Hughes and some aspects of his life. I'm going to focus primarily this evening on the latter part of his career, and that is his time in Washington, D.C. as an advocate for laws to protect American workers. This is, of course, the anniversary, as you pointed out, Angelica, of OSHA, and we have to remember that wasn't necessarily, it was a big step in the right direction for workers, but it wasn't the first step. And if we go back to the late 19th and early 20th century, Billy Hughes' time, we see the origins of that workers' rights movement. And I would put forth that Billy Hughes was instrumental in orchestrating those first steps forward for workers' rights. So I want to start in the year 1927. Billy Hughes, as you mentioned, Evelyn, died in 1918, but it was June 25th, 1927, that a group of people gathered in downtown Paterson, New Jersey, outside the Passaic County courthouse to commemorate the life of a man that many of them had known, had admired as a local hero, but had been dead for nearly a decade. They gathered there to commemorate a statue in front of the courthouse, an 8-foot-tall statue designed by the famous Italian-American sculptor Gaetano Federici. And there were dignitaries from near and far who came and addressed the crowd that afternoon. I'm going to speak about one of them, William Green, in a second. And they recalled Hughes' remarkable life of adversity, perseverance, fellowship, and the crusading spirit that he had. The onlookers waited with anticipation to see the bronze resemblance of a long-lost friend glimmer in the sun for the first time, as if he still walked among them, and roared approvingly when the likeness was finally revealed. William Hughes was an immigrant, a bobbin boy, a silk weaver in Paterson's many factories, a stenographer, soldier, lawyer, a family man, a U.S. congressman, and senator. He was a local hero. He was all of those things in less than 45 years of life. But to those who labored in Paterson's mills and factories across the country, in fact, no title or distinction that he earned came before that of friend to the working man. And one of the dignitaries that spoke on that day is a man named William Green, who was here. He was president of the American Federation of Labor. He had recently succeeded Samuel Gompers, probably one of the most famous figures in all of labor history, as president of the AFL. Green had come from Washington, D.C. that day to speak as the keynote speaker in honor of Hughes. And this is what he had to say about Billy Hughes. In characteristic fashion, he said, he gave freely to the cause of strikers who were fighting for the realization and enjoyment of economic and industrial freedom and for the humanization of industry. And I'd like to focus primarily this evening on those last three words, the humanization of industry. We're at a moment, I would argue, a pivot point in our own economy, although we've kind of transitioned even beyond an industrial economy, but we perhaps, I think, could be seeing over the next couple of years and decades a further dehumanization of our economy as we look towards the work of machines and the work of things like artificial intelligence. And my hope is that by looking to the life story of Billy Hughes, we can see some examples of steps that can be taken to further this cause of humanization of our economy. So this is what William Green argued made Billy Hughes a champion of labor. And of course, while well respected during his life and the years that immediately followed, Hughes has become a relatively obscure or forgotten figure. This was one of the things that made me so interested in his life, was not just what he did, what he managed to achieve, and his rags to riches story, but also the fact that it was largely forgotten about, despite this statue that exists in downtown Paterson. And it was the goal of my book to bring forth his story once again to the public, not just a local audience, but also a national one as well. He's largely been overlooked by historians of the Progressive Era, and this, of course, is the period of time during which he served in the halls of power. Evelyn, you already touched a little bit on his backstory, which is great. I of course, mentioned that he worked as a bobbin boy. Was his very first job at the age of 10 years old, replacing the spools in the silk mills, in the linen factory, the Barber Linen Factory, one of the many mills here in Paterson. This was just shortly after the family migrated from Drogheda in County Louth, Ireland, and they settled in Paterson shortly thereafter. He was the oldest surviving child of 6 at that point, and so the family needed economic support, and off went Billy out of school to work in the Barber factories. He eventually went on to become a silk weaver, was elected president of the Eastside Working Men's Association in 1897 at just 25 years of age. But he saw greater possibilities for himself than remaining in the silk mills. He went on to study stenography, took a job at a firm in New York City before returning to Paterson and working in the courts of Paterson as a court reporter. And from there he took a great interest in the law and chose to study the law. That was only briefly interrupted by his service in the Spanish-American War in 1898. He, along with many other Patersonians, volunteered to serve in the 2nd New Jersey Volunteer Infantry and were deployed down to Jacksonville, Florida during the summer of 1898 in the incredible heat and dealing with the malaria, the yellow fever, and all the other problems that went along with that. He was very anxious to go off to war and prove himself, but never got the opportunity because he spent most of his time working as a stenographer because he was one of the few men who had that skill set. It's upon returning and getting married that he came back to Paterson and took up his legal studies once again, studying under a man named John Briggs, who actually was at that time Attorney General of the United States under President William McKinley, a Republican. After completing his studies in the law, he passed the bar exam and became a lawyer. And it's a 1901 case of the Frank and Dugan strikers Frank & Dugan was another silk firm here in Paterson, that he really made a name for himself. He defended the striking workers who were prosecuted, quote unquote, for disturbing the peace as they serenaded the workers who chose not to participate in the strike and the strike breakers that were brought in to continue the work of the factory. He did his utmost during this time to keep the strikers out of prison, but it wasn't easy. He was working within the confines of a court system that was very pro-employer and very anti-labor, even here at a local level, but nationally as well. The courts were very much stacked against the reforms and the issues affecting labor at that time. But this event of arguing on behalf of the workers in Paterson made him a local hero, built his reputation as a hero of the working class. And this is what the Paterson Evening News had to say on July 3rd, 1901 about the work of Mr. Hughes in this case. Despite his hard, conscientious efforts, Mr. Hughes is doubtlessly the most squelched lawyer in Paterson has today. He has been sat on, choked off, and fined for contempt, but he has stuck gamely to the fight and is making the effort of his life on behalf of his clients. Mr. Hughes' position is not at present an enviable one, but when this case is completed, it can at least be said of him, he was game. Ultimately, some of the strikers were successful in staying out of prison. He and his law partner in this case, James Blauvelt, wound up appealing to the state superior court at that time, and then Blauvelt, just to give a shout out to him, actually wound up appealing the case all the way to the United States Supreme Court, although the US Supreme Court dismissed it for lack of jurisdiction at that time. But nonetheless, this is the case that made a name for Billy Hughes, and he was at that point able to leverage that newfound local fame into a run for office. The American Federation of Labor at this time, of course, was the nation's largest and most powerful labor union, and primarily consisted of males from Northern and Western Europe working in skilled trade jobs. Samuel Gompers was their long-term president. And in 1898, at the American Federation of Labor Convention, he said the following: "We want legislation in the interest of labor. We want legislation executed by labor men. We want trade unionists in Congress." And this was the start of a new vision, a new strategy that the American Federation of Labor had to implement the reforms that it was seeking. Going through the courts, fighting against the injunctions, hadn't worked. Many state reform laws had been struck down, and so now they turned their attention to the power of the federal government, getting trade unionists in the National Congress, our legislature, to try and make the laws that were going to benefit their workers. And so it's in this context, just 4 years later, that Billy Hughes becomes a candidate for Congress. At this point, he is not technically a trade unionist. He hasn't worked in the silk mills for quite some time. And it's only later on that he's going to receive an honorary trade union membership in, I believe, 1908 by one of the local labor unions in Paterson to honor his service. But nonetheless, he is viewed as a labor man because of his work defending the silk strikers, and he becomes closely aligned with the vision that the American Federation of Labor has. Of course, in order to win this campaign, he's got to go up against, ironically, his former employer, or at least the son of his former employer, a man named William Barber, who's one of the most powerful and wealthiest and most well-connected men in the city of Paterson, even in national Republican politics. He had attended several Republican national committees, was very active in the American Protective Tariff League. This was a guy who was a very formidable candidate and running for Congress in a district that typically voted relatively overwhelmingly for the Republican candidate. Billy Hughes, as I mentioned, was a Democrat. And so the fact that he manages to win in 1902 this race is nothing short of remarkable, considering that Republicans typically dominated not only in Paterson, but in the state of New Jersey at this time. And I think it says a lot that after winning this race, which I talk about in chapter 3 of the book, and I don't want to dwell on too much this evening, but one of the first actions that he takes upon winning the election against Barber is he travels out to Pennsylvania, and he goes to visit the anthracite coal mine workers of western Pennsylvania, who had recently been on a national strike that had actually threatened the welfare of the country. President Theodore Roosevelt famously had to step in and try and negotiate a solution to this strike. But he goes there in solidarity with the workers, and he goes there to try and understand the issues facing workers. And I think this is an important point to make, because he's not just concerned about the workers in the silk mills of Paterson, right? This is a guy who's taking a more national vision to Washington, D.C. about what the federal government can do to help all workers, not just workers in silk mills in one city of the country. He's going to ultimately serve 4 terms in Congress. He serves from 1903 to 1905. He loses re-election in 1904 very, very narrowly, but is returned to Congress in 1906, where he'll serve until resigning from the United States House to take a judgeship in 1912. And during that time, he fights for several different initiatives within the federal government. Now, for most of that tenure, Republicans control the House of Representatives and the presidency. So as a Democrat, William Hughes is serving in the minority of Congress, and so he's putting forth these bills and these suggestions, but they're not getting a lot of action, right? They're not making a lot of progress with some of his ideas. It's not until 1911, when Democrats take control of majority in Congress, that they're able to work a bit with President William Howard Taft, who was a progressive Republican, to try and get some of these reforms too. And it's in 1912 that President Taft actually suggests a new federal commission outside of Congress, a specially assigned commission to just deal with the issues affecting industrial workers in the country. It becomes known as the U.S. Commission on Industrial Relations, and it is none other than Congressman William Hughes of Paterson who introduces the bill to create that commission in the House of Representatives, along with Republican Senator William Borah of Idaho, who introduces it in the other chamber of Congress. It passes into law on June 19, 1912, and became law on August 23rd, 1912. Hughes was actually initially appointed by William Howard Taft to serve on that commission, but none of Taft's appointments were ever confirmed by the Senate because Taft went on several months later to lose re-election. And so it's Woodrow Wilson, who ultimately, Taft's successor, who will go on to appoint the candidates for the commission. By that point, William Hughes is serving in the United States Senate. So this commission is later on known as the Walsh Commission. It had 154 days of hearings and published its final report in 1916 in 11 volumes. Studied major instances of labor unrest, including, of course, the 1913 Paterson silk strike, which occurred during the first few months of Hughes' term in office. And among the more widely reported findings contained in the final report was that, quote, one Paterson silk mill fined workers 50 cents for talking and 50 cents for laughing while at work. Several labor historians, including Bruce Kaufman and Philip Taft, have written that the Commission's findings greatly influenced U.S. national pro-labor policies during World War I, and again, some 20 years later, during the New Deal of the 1930s. So this wound up being a very influential commission that Hughes helped create, even though he wasn't actually involved with the work that it carried out. I already mentioned that Hughes is going to go on to serve in the United States Senate, and he'll serve there as a very close ally, not just as of the American Federation of Labor, but also of this man here, New Jersey governor, former New Jersey governor, and at that point, President Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson was very fond of his friend Billy Hughes. It was said that Woodrow Wilson only ever called 3 people by their first name when he served in office, and Billy Hughes was one of them, and it shows the fondness of their relationship. Wilson said of Hughes, "There isn't a man who is more trusted in the United States to speak wise counsel as to what legislation is just and possible for the plain working people of this country than William Hughes." And I think William Hughes' short time, 5 or so years in the United States Senate, speaks in support of Wilson's claim. One of the most immediate and important priorities of the American Federation of Labor during this time was to amend the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act, which of course was very important during the Progressive era as the government used it to go after the monopolists, the trusts that were taking over control not just of the economy but also the government. Well, many of the courts, as well as the Department of Justice, also viewed this law as a tool to go after cooperations of workers, in other words, to go after labor unions for their power. And of course, the AFL wanted this policy stopped. Hughes, on several instances while he was in the House, introduced an amendment to do this. In fact, his initial attempt to pass this reform became sort of a litmus test for candidates that the AFL would support. They had to have voted in favor or been in support of Hughes's amendment. And so although this effort failed during earlier terms in Congress, by 1913, with Woodrow Wilson in office, with a Democratic majority in both houses of Congress, finally this reform is passed, that the Department of Justice is no longer enabled to go after labor organizations using federal taxpayer dollars. Fast forward to the year 1916, which is probably one of the most momentous years for pro-labor legislation in our country's history. Hughes is arguing in favor of the Adamson Act, which brought about the 8-hour workday for railroad workers. He's arguing in favor of the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act, which limited working hours for children and forbade the interstate sale of goods produced by child labor. This is at a time when it was calculated that more than 2 million children under the age of 12 were employed in the various fields, mines, factories, and stores of the United States. And finally, he argued in favor of the Kern-McGillicuddy Bill, later become the Federal Employees Compensation Act, which established compensation to federal employees for wages lost due to job-related injuries. Several states, such as New Jersey, had already implemented that reform at the state level, but no such program existed yet at the federal level. In addition to that, he also advocated at large for an 8-hour workday for not only federal workers, but workers who were employed by the federal government through contracts, right? So if a private employer was contracted out by the federal government to do work, it had to abide by the 8-hour workday. And so although the 8-hour day is not something that's going to be solidified as a major reform for some time, at this point, William Hughes is pushing the country in that direction. One of his final legislative endeavors was to introduce a bill which would have doubled the pay of enlisted soldiers in the United States Army upon the entry of the U.S. into World War I, which was April of 1917. And he also, in that month, introduced a bill to investigate a strike among Washington, D.C.'s streetcar operators. We see, therefore, the various aspects of the industrial economy that William Hughes sought to reform during his short time, his 4 terms in the House, and his just over half a term in the United States Senate. And so it's for this reason that a decade later, workers from at least a dozen states made donations or subscriptions to help fund the Hughes Monument in Paterson. The inscription on the marble base fittingly reads, "Erected by a grateful public, whose subscriptions were testimonials to his outstanding service in labor's cause." Ironically, it really became labor's cause a decade after his death to build this statue. So I think that's quite a fitting testament to his service. I'd like to end this evening by discussing some of the through lines we see between the past and the present. What are these through lines between the life of this once forgotten champion of labor, who died over a century ago, and the ongoing fight for labor rights today? What can his life story teach us about the humanization of industry, about the humanization of our economy? Over the last several decades in this country, we've witnessed the replacement of workers by machines. More recently, there have been growing concerns over the role of artificial intelligence in our economy, or even in our classrooms, because my students are quite fond of using it. Are we on the cusp of a new industrial revolution? Perhaps. Will such a revolution manifest itself in a mode which sidelines millions of workers, erodes their bargaining power, grows inequality, and makes it more difficult for the working people of this country to make an honest living? Steps must be taken now if we are to prevent this technological transformation from resulting in a dehumanization of our modern economy. Policies which we put into place now will shape the future, and for this reason, the working people of our country must hold our elected representatives accountable. Likewise, we should not forget that in many parts of the world, workers will still struggle for even the most basic protections. Events such as the 2013 Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh, the deaths of Chinese factory workers at Foxconn facilities, all are recent reminders of this. We are participants in a global economy which all too frequently exploits and dehumanizes people. In the life of William Hughes, it's easy to see a rags to riches story, a remarkable fulfillment of what we refer to today as the American dream. But I don't think that's what should be emphasized about his life, or at least not the only thing that should be emphasized. What I prefer to focus on is that this was a man who saw value in public service and, with a few exceptions, used his time and energy while in office to support and fight for the working man, the little guy, the downtrodden. Though he served less than 4 complete terms in the House and not quite a full term in the Senate, Hughes was able to leverage his powerful biography, political prowess, personal relationships, and a few moments of luck and opportunity to achieve a fairly impressive resume of legislative achievements for the working people of the United States. His list of consequential accomplishments is longer than one might expect, given his short life and term of service. From his work to limit the U.S. Department of Justice's powers to prosecute labor unions, to the establishment of the Commission on Industrial Relations, to his contributions to the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act, and the power he exerted influencing the political appointments of the Wilson administration. Hughes regularly leveraged his legislative and political skills, along with Paterson's industrial significance, to attain important goals in the fight for workers' rights and further the humanization of our industrial economy. Thank you very much.
Can you tell us a little bit about your exhibit that you have?
Sure. So over the years that I've been researching Hughes, I managed to collect a few artifacts relevant to his life. So whenever a member of Congress or the United States Senate dies, it's customary for members of Congress to make appearances on the floor of that chamber of Congress and speak in eulogy and memorial to that individual. So this is an original copy of the remarks that were delivered on the floor of the Senate, the government published version, after William Hughes passed away on January 30th, 1918. We also have from his one and only Senate campaign, a campaign button from 1912 that would have been worn by a supporter of Hughes. His probably the most formal portrait that he ever sat for, at least the one that survived to today. It's on the Library of Congress website. This is William Hughes around the year 1912. The date's not specified, but this is how he would have looked in the year that he was campaigning for the Senate. This is an original document signed by the hand of William Hughes when he was on the U.S. Commission, the Senate Committee. I think this is the Senate Committee for Pensions. You can see the letterhead is, Committee on Expenditures in the Navy Department, which I believe he was the chairman of, and this is him responding to a constituent's concern that had been expressed. And then finally over here, there's only a few papers remaining written in William Hughes' hand that survived to today. Most of his public papers got lost to history, either destroyed or they're buried in somebody's attic somewhere, maybe to be discovered someday. But in the Library of Congress, in the Joseph Patrick Tumulty papers, Joseph Patrick Tumulty was the personal secretary of President Woodrow Wilson, also a New Jersey man from Jersey City. The two were very close friends. And these are some of their surviving letters. William Hughes fell ill in April of 1917 and was recuperating at Greenwood Lake and at a hospital in Trenton when he penned these letters to Joseph Tumulty. 4 of them are written in Hughes' original hand. I'm assuming the first one was probably written by his wife or daughter because it's a feminine handwriting and it doesn't match Hughes' other writing. So if anybody's interested in what Hughes was sharing with Tumulty, what he was talking about is what ultimately wound up being his deathbed, but he didn't know at the time, I have transcripts of the letters. Or you can try and interpret his chicken scratch for yourself. It was not easy to read, and I had to take several cracks at it. I'll just finish by saying that if anybody's interested in the book, I believe copies are going to be available here at the American Labor Museum. You can also go to madeinpaterson.com, which will direct you to Amazon to purchase a copy of the book, or if you'd like a signed copy of the book, you can always reach out to me using the contact form on that website, and I'm happy to send you one via the mail. And I'll also be speaking at the Paterson Museum on May 20th about the book at 1:00 p.m. in the afternoon. I believe admission for that is free.
Great, thank you again.
You're
Any
welcome.
questions from the audience?
Or our virtual audience, maybe.
Yeah, or our virtual audience.
Dan, I got a question.
Oh, we have to unmute
World
them.
War I.
Sorry, sir. Sorry, we're all out of time.
World War I. What were they making the troops when he wanted to get them double the idea?
I don't know off the top of my head. I'm sure I read it at some point, but I don't
Should I try another question?
Wanted to
Should I
sure.
try another? Go ahead, you must have a question, huh? No question? Any questions back here?
I'm good.
Any question from the audience? That's the virtual audience? I guess not.
Okay.
But,
Thank you very much for having me.
oh
It's a
my
treat.
goodness, thank you.
Hold on, we
so
got a
much.
question. We
question.
got a question.
All right, here we go.
You mentioned about the 8-hour workday for
Yeah.
railroad workers.
Interstate railroad workers.
Okay.
Because at the
What was the
time,
average workday for most people in labor back then? I mean, was it 12
12,
hours?
13, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. You know, you usually get Sunday off, but.
Was he more, and he was more concerned about the railroad workers because?
Well, because it was felt at the time, because the powers of Congress were much more limited at that time. And they, you know, especially with the courts being very conservative, they didn't feel that Congress would overstep its authority if it tried to, let's say, regulate the contractual hours of a baker in Paterson, right? But because of the interstate commerce clause in the Constitution, Congress has the power to regulate anything that crosses state lines, including people, right? And so that's how they were able to justify, under the Constitution, regulating the hours of interstate railroad workers only.
Interesting. Thank you.
It wasn't until later on that the powers of the government became more expansive. During the New Deal, President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, put more liberal-minded justices on the court who were in favor of those more expansive government powers to regulate things, even that, you know, didn't necessarily cross state lines. But this is still a debate that we're having today, right? How expansive the powers of the government should be to regulate such things.
And when did overtime start? Payment for overtime, if you work?
I have no idea.
Okay.
Roosevelt administration.
Roosevelt administration?
Yeah, it was
Thank you.
FDR's administration, put
Okay.
that in. Because also you had the minimum wage that was instituted
Yes.
during the Roosevelt administration.
Yes, as well as programs like Social Security
Okay.
Yeah.
during that time period. Yep.
And
We
some
had the
of the
first
early
woman
child labor
labor,
laws were overturned by
Secretary
the
of Labor.
Supreme Court.
Right, so that's that Keating-Owen Child Labor Act that I mentioned. I mentioned the Child Labor Act that he was arguing in favor of. The following year, the Supreme Court struck that down as unconstitutional. It was never enforced. And so it wasn't until later on that child labor was actually 20 years later.
Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to believe.
Yeah.
It seems like distant history, but it's not so distant in the
No,
grand scheme
no.
of things.
Nope.
Well, the Secretary Treasurer of the New Jersey State AFL-CIO found out about this evening's event, and she couldn't make it, so she called me and said, please purchase the book for her. So I was really very, very happy that
No problem.
she was very interested in this.
Very nice.
And my high school friend is on, and I'm going to purchase one for him as well.
Great.
As a gift, for him, Richie.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
It was a pleasure to be here this evening. Thank you,
Oh,
everybody.
and thank you.